Well, welcome everybody. This is Cheese in Depth, and I'm Michael Landis. And today we were very fortunate to be able to meet up and talk with a good friend of mine with Cigar City Brewing, Neil. And Neil and I have worked together many times. We've been all around the country, did invent a Great American Beer Festival, and have basically been playing with beer and cheese for a pretty long time. So it's really fun to be able to sit back and enjoy the direction that Neil's going to go in. A lot of times I do all the pairing and all that, but Neil's got a lot of experience in this, and it's really fun to be able to have a direction like this, and also to have 5 fabulous beers and, of course, 5 fabulous cheeses along with it. So I'm going to turn it over to Neil. He's going to talk about a little bit about the history, some fun things there, and then we're going to get to a little drinking. All right, Neil?
It's Friday afternoon. We might as well get into some drinking, right?
That's right.
It's a beautiful thing. Well, like Michael had said, my name is Neil Callaghan. I'm the brand manager with Cigar City Brewing. I've been with Cigar City for coming up almost 6 years now. And my current position as brand manager, a lot of it is just getting out and telling the story of Cigar City Brewing. When I started with the company back in 2014, we were relatively small. 98% of our beer was sold in the state of Florida. And as we've grown and become a national brand where we're distributed in 47 states now and over 14 international markets as well, a lot of my job has been to get around the country and get around the world and really tell people what Cigar City is all about, tell people about our approach to brewing, tell people about some of the ingredients that we're using, sort of how we've come up with some of the names, and really, tell people why they should really get excited about what we're doing down here in Tampa at Cigar City Brewing. So I'm in an incredibly fortunate situation. Like Michael said, again, we've been kind of crossing paths around the country, talking about beer and talking about cheese and the interactions and pairings together. So I get to travel around and talk about beer for a living. So it could be much, much worse. I am a advanced Cicerone. So Cicerone is analogous to the sommelier program for wine. Cicerone is for beer. And I was the first person to have that rank in the state of Florida. There's a little over 100 people in the world that have that advanced certification, and I was the first one to do it in the state of Florida. So again, really kind of getting around the country, getting around the world, and telling people about beer is my position, which really definitely could be worse. But part of telling people about beer and about Cigar City Brewing also talks about how our beer interacts with different food, and specifically in this instance with cheese. And we're in a very fortunate position where our brewmaster, a guy named Wayne Wombles, and as we go into kind of the history of Cigar City Brewing, we'll talk about him a good amount. He comes from a culinary background. He's worked in kitchens. He's worked in the food industry for a number of years. So really when he's designing a beer, he's got food pairings, he's got cheese pairings in mind. So we're coming from a very fortunate situation in that sense, that really when he's designing a new recipe, he's designing it with pairings in mind and really with complementary approaches in mind, where he doesn't really want to have a beer that is going to overwhelm the majority of dishes that you might end up pairing it with. So again, we're in a very fortunate situation to have him designing a lot of our new beers and a lot of our recipes, and certainly some of the classic Cigar City recipes like the High Life IPA, which is our flagship beer, the Hunapoo's Imperial Stout, the Maduro Brown Ale that we're going to be drinking later on. That was the first beer that we ever brewed. So again, I'm in a very fortunate situation where I'm at, and I'm in an incredibly fortunate situation to be with Cigar City Brewing down here in Tampa, Florida. And really, Joey Redner, who is the guy who started Cigar City Brewing, and he's been a good friend of Michael's for quite a while. When he developed his brewery, he really wanted to tell the story of Florida and Tampa culture, Tampa history through beer. So it's really it's an exciting brewery to be with, and to see the way that the brand has grown over the last 6 years that I've been with it has really been remarkable. To go from, again, essentially 98% of our beer being sold in the state of Florida to now I go to Seattle and I can get a fresh High Life. I've been able to, fortunately, been able to travel around to places like Russia and places like Hong Kong and Eastern Europe, and I can get a High Life. It's pretty amazing. It's an incredibly cool brewery to be with, and it's really been a lot of fun. So Michael, if you do want to kind of dive right into the first slide and kind of tell folks a little bit about Cigar City Brewing and sort of where we came from and where we're going as a brand, we can dive right into that. So as we go on to kind of the first slide, really, we don't want to get in too deep on, the history and all that stuff. It's important. It does inform a lot of where we're going as a brewery, but really, the beer and the cheese is really kind of front and center. But again, the context of where we came from is really going to help, I think, appreciate what we're going to be drinking. So again, Cigar City was founded by Joey Redner back in 2007. Joey's a fifth generation Floridian. He's lived his whole life in Tampa. So he was looking around at the Tampa Bay area. And, when we're talking Tampa Bay, we're talking Tampa proper, St. Petersburg, Sarasota. So as a whole, it's an area of about 3.2 million people. Back in 2007, when he founded the company, there were 6 craft breweries for an area of over 3 million people. And if you were to index that against places like Colorado, Southern California, we were really, really under indexed as far as the number of breweries. So Joey really saw a wide open playing field for beer. And he'd been involved in the beer industry. He'd been a writer for the Tampa Bay Times. He'd owned a bar down on Davis Island. So he'd been interested in beer and really excited about the possibilities that craft brewing in Tampa could really bring about. So founded the company in 2007. The name Cigar City, it's a reference to, again, Florida history. Joey wanted to tell the story of his hometown through beer. So late 1800s, early 1900s, Tampa was the biggest purchaser of Cuban-made tobacco in the world before the Cuban Revolution. So you can't talk about Tampa history without talking about cigar history. Tampa was known as the cigar capital of the world. That's where the name Cigar City comes from, it's pretty great. So he founded the company in 2007, 2008. He got on probrewer.com and made a classified ad and said, hey, I'm opening up a brewery down in Tampa, Florida. I'm looking for an ambitious and really skilled brewmaster who can help bring my vision to life. And the guy, if we're looking at the top left-hand corner there, the guy on the right, that's our brewmaster, Wayne Wombles. So Wayne is still our brewmaster and Joey is obviously still our founder. So those two guys are still involved with the company. That's what we're looking at in the top left-hand picture is actually the earliest picture of those two guys inside of the brewery. This is before the brewery even opened. You can see they're kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and had no idea what kind of the beer world had in store for them. So those two guys on January 30th, 2009 brewed the very, very first batch of Cigar City beer, which was a batch of Maduro Brown Ale. We're going to be drinking through that and pairing that with some cheese in just a little bit. And really, when Joey started the company, he didn't want to be tied down to a single brand. It's not like he really had the idea for a Maduro Brown Ale or a High Life IPA and said, all right, this is sort of what we're going to be known for. He wanted Wayne and his brewing staff to have as much leeway and as much latitude to kind of brew whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. First beer we brewed, again, was Maduro Brown Ale. Then the second beer we brewed was High Life IPA, which is to this day our best-selling beer. It represents over half of our overall production as a brewery. And even though Joey didn't want to be tied down to an individual brand, he recognized that, people really like this High Life IPA and they really like the Maduro Brown Ale. So, you know what, let's try to create as much of that as possible. So to go from essentially Joey and Wayne brewing beer inside of an unair-conditioned warehouse on Spruce Street over in Tampa, Florida, basically to go from a two-man operation to now being, again, distributed as a national brand and distributed around the world has been really quite a venture for those guys, and to do it in such a short period of time. Again, we're talking 2009, the very first batch of beer, so a little over 11 years later, and we've grown an awful lot. And we can kind of dive into the second slide there, which really talks about that growth trajectory from those early stages. So again, the first beer we ever brewed was that Maduro Brown Ale. And really right out of the gate, the ambitious approach that Wayne was taking to brewing some of these beers got him recognition not only locally in Tampa, but also on a national scale. And that was really borne out with a gold medal at GABF at the Great American Beer Festival. And like Michael was saying, that's still to this day an incredibly important event in the world of craft beer. So to be a brand that's less than a year old and still get national and international recognition at GABF for Humidor IPA, that really, I think, spoke volumes about how ambitious and how skilled Wayne and Joey were in their approach to making beer. So even though we were growing in the Tampa area, Tampa, again, was a very underdeveloped area. So there wasn't as much of a vibrant craft beer scene, certainly as there is now. And Joey, being sort of the smart businessman that he is, he said, you know what, even though we're barely making a dent in the Tampa Bay area, what if we get our name out there in these more developed craft beer markets, places like Philadelphia, places like New York City? He said, if I can get beer geeks' attention in these more established craft markets, then I think that's really going to help grow the brand. And that is exactly what ended up happening. Even though 98% of our beer was just sold in Florida until 2016, we were in some key markets, again, New York City, Philadelphia, Richmond, Virginia. And through that, and also through the fact that Florida has, obviously for a long time, been a tourist destination. So we get a lot of folks who were coming down from those places in the Northeast, and they, oh yeah, I went down to Florida, I went to Disney, and I had this Highlight IPA, and oh, it was so good. And it really helped fuel the recognition of the brand throughout the country. It was really phenomenal. And then what allowed us to become a national brand, back in 2016, we partnered up with a group called Canarchy. And Canarchy is a craft brewery co-op. The largest brewery at the time when we partnered up was Oscar Blues, and they have been a pioneer in craft beer for many, many, many years. They were essentially the first craft brewery to put beer into cans. If you remember back in 2004, 2005, when you would see Dale's Pale Ale, there really wasn't a big, flavorful, hoppy beer like that that was in cans. The consumer perception back then was really that cans were for yellow beer. They were for bad beer. They were for, the Bud Miller Coors of the world. And Oscar Blues was really pushing that boulder up the hill way, way before anybody else. And we made that switch back in 2012 from 12-ounce bottles to 12-ounce cans, really because they're a better vessel for the beer, keep the beer fresher, lighter to ship, more recyclable. They keep UV light out. They keep oxygen out much better than the Crown does on a 12-ounce bottle of beer. But all that to say, Oscar Blues had been a pioneer in craft beer and still continues to be years later. So they were kind of the headline brewery within this craft brewery co-op called Canarchy. And really what drew us was the ability to grow. Oscar Blues has 3 breweries around the country. The other breweries that are in the co-op, places like Squatters and Wasatch out in Utah, places like Deep Ellum down in Texas, those places all were able to really shift around production. So to be able to now be able to brew High Life in a place like Brevard, North Carolina at the Oscar Blues facility where they have capacity and where we have demand and they have capacity, it really worked out great. The other nice thing about partnering up with a brewery co-op like that with Canarchy is it's a lot easier to weather kind of the stormy seas of craft beer as a larger ship than a bunch of smaller boats. When we're going to buy, say, hops, when we're going to buy malts, when we're buying raw materials, when we're shopping for health insurance for employees, we're able to do that as a larger organization, and that really gives us a lot more strength. So even though we all operate as independent breweries, we don't check with Oscar Blues before we brew a beer and vice versa. It really gives us a lot of, again, strength as a larger organization. And that's really the way that we've been able to grow, essentially from being in 6 states, but essentially 1 state back in 2016 to now again being in 47 states, which is really, it's been a wild ride. Absolutely. And we can move on to the next slide, which kind of gives us this quick snapshot of where Cigar City Brewing is in the year 2020. We are right now the 2nd largest craft brewery in the state of Florida. It's always kind of a good head scratcher. The largest craft brewery in the state of Florida, it's actually Yuengling. Yuengling is still considered a craft brewery. They're still family owned. They're still a traditional brewery. They make beer on a 250 barrel brew house. We make beer on a 15 and a 30 barrel brew house. So they make more beer in an afternoon than we do at our facility in Tampa in about a longer period of time. We'll leave it at that. So all that to say, we're not catching up to a brand like Yuengling, but we're also kind of approaching craft from a different way as Yuengling. Even though Yuengling has been a phenomenal steward for craft beer, and really they were excited to help grow craft with Cigar City. So that's another nice thing, as we talk about craft breweries in general, but specific to Tampa Bay, it really is an attitude of the rising tide carries all ships. We don't see other breweries in the area as competition. And for the most part, other breweries don't see us as competition. There's so much room for all of these breweries to grow. again, we were talking about 2007 when the brewery was founded. There were 6 craft breweries in the area. You fast forward 11 years later, there's over 80 craft breweries in the area. And again, as long as we sort of work together as an industry to elevate craft and to make sure we're all making the highest quality and most consistent beers we can, we really feel like that elevates our category as a whole, which is, it's not many breweries, or I'm sorry, there's not many industries where you can say that about essentially the competition, that we're all looking out for each other. But thankfully in the state of Florida and specific to Tampa Bay, that attitude really does prevail. And I know, Michael working with breweries like 610 and other breweries in the area, we really all are looking out for each other, which is phenomenal. Again, we are in 47 and 48 is just kind of coming around as far as the number of states that we're distributed in. We're in over 14 international markets right now. Again, I'm fortunate I get to travel around the world and talk to people about Cigar City beer. So again, a few years ago, I got to go to Russia and they said, oh yes, Cigar City, you do JLA beer. It's very good, very good. It's been really cool to see that we're a relatively small brewery in Tampa, and we have that international recognition, which has really been great. We have over 100 employees in the Tampa Bay area, and we are fortunate to be stewards for craft beer in the state of Florida. And we wouldn't be able to do that without other breweries in the area, without doing collaborations with local breweries, with national and international breweries, and without partnering up with people like Michael and helping to get the word out about our beer and how it really, again, does have a culinary influence and how it does have pairing and, really complementing factors between food and cheese specifically and our beer. So without people like Michael, we wouldn't be where we are. And thankfully, where we're at right now in the year 2020 is a pretty good spot.
Well, I certainly appreciate that. When I moved here from Alaska, I was working for a distributor and I was the beer guy. So I had access to a tremendous amount of beer, and we had a local brewery, Alaska Brewing there, that was a mainstay on the taps. And my biggest bar, I had about 24 taps that I worked with. And so I was bringing in a lot of craft beer. So when I moved here in 2000, it was very disappointing because this was not what you would expect of a craft beer. I mean, maybe they would have something unusual on there, but it was almost all domestically large production, and it was also European. So we had that here. And when Joey came up, in the beers, I was just getting into cheese at that time. In 2005, I started. So when he started up, it was kind of like, this is so cool. Wayne and I and Joey, I remember we sat around a table that was the brewery basically on the side because there wasn't any other room in there. And, just threw some cheeses together and did some work. And it was a lot of fun. And that development helped me out a lot. There was a lot of things that I really, as much as I knew beer, having Wayne and having Joey kind of coaching along as what they were doing and what I wanted to do with the cheese helped me kind of drive that direction. So we have a really great symbolic relationship of being able to help each other so much. And of course, the quality of the beers is paramount. It's not just about we're missing a beer, so let's make something. It was more every time I went in, it was a evolution of something, and it was always a lot of fun. And I think the historical impact of where each of the beer names came from, going up north and, talking about beers and having them available, and starting out with Cracker. I get a lot of funny remarks about that, but in Florida, it has a completely different direction, a very honest and very long-standing tradition here. So, this is a great journey with me as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Joey's always been a big history buff on top of being a beer geek. So any opportunity for him to tell the story about Florida and about Tampa, he always wants to take advantage of. So, Florida Cracker is a great example. Even though that reference might not resonate with, New York or Texas or wherever, he always has said, look, this is just an opportunity for us to tell the story about Florida, about the original European settlers, and Florida being the first cattle state, the very, very first cattle that were imported into the colonies at the time came to Florida. It wasn't Texas, it wasn't Oklahoma, it was Florida. So he really sees these, something like pronunciation on Guayabera as well. He looks at that, it's a challenge for some people to say, and people might not get the reference, but that's an opportunity for us to tell the story about Florida, which is, most business owners don't have that approach and that take on things. And that's, I think, part of why we are where we are right now as a brand, is Joey not shying away from challenges like that. It's been very cool.
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, speaking of that, actually, our first beer is a Citra Pale Ale. So let me pull this slide up, and you can give us a little bit of information where we start off. So let's start with this.
Sure. So the first beer we've got up, this is our Citra Pale Ale. This is a brand we originally introduced back in 2014 and scaled it up to national as a year-round brand back in 2016. So this is a Citra Pale Ale, and Citra is a hop variety. So this beer is hopped exclusively with Citra. When I think Citra, I think berry, lime leaf, a little bit more herbaceous, whereas something like Highlight IPA is going to offer more of that clementine, tangerine, that more vibrant citrus. Guayabera goes for more of kind of an herbaceous quality from the hops. 5.5%. The malt bill is pretty simplistic. You're going to get a little bit of bread crust, just a little touch of caramel to it, and that's really to kind of temper the bitterness. But the hop, Citra, is really front and center on this beer. And in selecting it with the cheese, we wanted to go for something that was moderate intensity. We didn't want to go with something like a really rich, funky blue cheese or something like that, because that would walk all over the nuance in the beer. And vice versa. We didn't want the beer pairing up with the cheese to be something that was going to be too bitter or something that was going to be too citrusy. So in working with Michael and the number of times that we have, really the first thing that we do when we're looking at pairings is let's match intensity. So we don't want to have something that's a little less intense on the palate, something, again, like we're going to be drinking Defeated Statesman, which is a pretty straightforward American lager. We don't want to have something like that with a very funky, very creamy, very heavy on the palate sort of cheese. So what I love about pairing beer or pairing food, specifically cheese, with Guayabera is that it is a really middle of the road as far as alcohol. It's only 5.5%. As far as bitterness, with a lot of our hoppy beers, the IBUs, which is a measurement of bitterness, that's International Bittering Units, even though the measured IBUs might be a little high, when you taste Guayabera or High Life, for instance, the bitterness really takes a back seat. It's all about the hop aroma and hop flavor sitting up front. The reference, as far as the name, it's a shirt that is very popular in Latin culture. So if you picture sort of a guy in Cuba with a fedora, smoking a big cigar, he's probably wearing a Guayabera. It's a linen shirt. It's got 2 pockets up here, 2 pockets down around the belly. It's got kind of pleats right down the side. So it's meant to be a shirt that is comfortable, it's light, it's airy, but it's also formal. It's also something you could wear to a wedding, but is also going to be comfortable. And that's, again, kind of the approach that Joey and Wayne wanted to take with Guayabera is let's make something that's not too formal, not too intense, but also has some substance to it. And I think the Guayabera shirt actually kind of does that as well. And if you kind of look in right at the top of the can there, you can see there's a Guayabera right at the top. And I'm sure that some folks watching now will go, oh, yeah, that's what it is. So 2 pockets on each side, pleats down the sides. That's a Guayabera.
That's cool.
And then again, getting into sort of the aroma and taste on this one, and I'm sure same thing we're doing with wine, where we're going to start when we're doing sort of a serious sensory perception on this. We're going to swirl it around, release a little bit of the volatiles. And the nice thing with beer as well, not only are you swirling it around to release some of the aroma, you're also releasing some carbonation. So I'm sure nobody watching this has ever chugged a beer before. But what I'm told is when you chug a beer, you get this burn in the back of your throat. That's CO2, that's carbonic acid, which for the most part, you're not really getting with wine. When you reduce the carbonation by swirling some of the beer around, you're reducing some of the CO2, or you're reducing the carbonic acid, and you're actually getting a little more flavor out of the beer in addition to releasing some of the volatiles. So that's why as we go through these, you'll see me kind of swirling around and probably shaking the computer camera a little bit. But again, with this one, I'm always thinking berry, lime leaf, a little bit of bread crust, a little bit of caramel, just a little touch. For the most part, the malt bill is 2-row, just base malt with a little touch of some crystal malt in there for some color and for some, just a little touch of caramel. Color-wise on this one, you know, it does have this really nice kind of deep gold color. It's a little, just trying to get the light right there. And it isn't crystal clear, but it certainly isn't a hazy beer. It's not a hazy pale ale or anything like that. But on the palate, yeah, a lot more of that sort of kaffir lime leaf, a little bit of blueberry, a little bit of a raspberry quality as well. But again, the word just herbaceous always comes to mind when I go through Guayabera Citra Pale Ale. Doesn't have any alcohol burn, and the bitterness, again, is sort of taking a back seat on this one. And Michael, I don't know if you want to touch on some of the cheese, or the cheese that we're going to be pairing this particular beer with.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you know, when we were talking about this, I've been very fortunate as every one of these beers I've had an opportunity to be able to taste multiple times. You know, living in Tampa and growing up with all the fun things that Joey has done, and, you know, spending a fair amount of time at the brewery myself, and in research and drinking of the brands and all that. I think that starting off with something fresh like the goat cheese is really an appropriate direction. It's as light and it's as creamy as you would want to have with this style of beer. Pale ales have always been my first direction with this, because we have a lot of lemon that comes out of the goat cheese, and that's that lactic acid that you get from it. But there's also a nice amount of creaminess that you get. And Vermont Creamery is well known for having a buttery flavor in their goat cheese. And so that's what I chose. For cracker-wise, I've decided that using pretty much the same style all the way through, and that's the rustic bakery. And I just use a plain olive oil and sea grizz across the board. It gives it some structure, allows me to be able to dig through it and to be able to get to the cheese. So, you know, one of the things that you notice about this is that it's not as crumbly as you see. It's got a lot of creaminess to it. And that's really important to understand, that there's a fine line between crumbly dry and too much whey. Whey is a natural part of the cheese, but what it can do is it can make it mushy. And the quality of this cheese is so rich, and you can see creaminess on here. You can crumble this, but it's going to stick together, which is really good, because it shows you that there's a lot of moisture in this particular cheese. That moisture also brings that creamy, buttery fat that you really love in the cheese. So that's the direction that I went with putting these together. But also, because we have that acidity here, I wanted to warm it up a little bit. And another Vermont product that is the Fat Toad Farm. And the Fat Toad Farm does, this is from a goat's milk. So we have a goat's milk, and this is their original caramel. And you don't need a lot. In other words, we're not trying to make this a dessert. What we're doing is that we're taking the edge of this off just a little bit to be able to give us a little bit of sweetness. And that's a direction that, you know, I thought would be really fun for us to be able to go in.
Sure. Yeah, Michael, what I'm really liking about this pairing, the fact that the cheese is obviously on the buttery, on the creamy side, but Guayabera is a relatively effervescent beer. It does have that nice carbonation. And that's kind of those scrubbing bubbles, essentially, are helping to lift some of that creaminess and some of the buttery quality off of the palate. And then the acidity, like you were saying, that's in the cheese, to me is really emphasizing that berry quality. It's really even making the berry flavor that's in the hops pop even more, really kind of jump out of the glass even more. This is a phenomenal pairing. This is, I'm liking this a lot. And again, the intensity matching is there. The nuance of the cheese is coming through. The nuance of the beer is coming through. It's not that one is, you know, overwhelming the other. I'm really, really enjoying this.
You know, for people that love a sharp cheddar, you know, that they say, well, I really love a super sharp, that tanginess that you have here. Goat cheeses give us that same similar lemony flavor, the lemon lime that you get through here. But adding it with the Citra here brings that level up a bit more. I don't know if you noticed it, but we really got a good citrus quality out of this that brought in more of that tanginess, but that underlining butter comes across. And I think that's where we pick up the grain as well, is you get the biscuit that kind of comes across. And, you know, you really don't need these additionals, but they are helpful in being able to have a vehicle to move the cheese from point A to point B. This would be, you want to start off a meal with an appetizer that isn't going to be weigh you down, and you want to have something in the afternoon. You're thinking, oh, you know, I'm going to have a beer, and you know, I want something to go with it. This goat cheese is paired up beautifully. It's a match. I mean, you know, a lot of times you talk about, well, it does one thing or it does another. It takes away or it adds. This is just, they both come together beautifully.
Yeah, very complimentary pairings there. It's really lovely. I was Michael and I were catching up yesterday on this pairing, and I was saying to have all this cheese in my fridge staring at me all week has been an exercise in self-control. So I'm glad I'm having to not having to fight that urge anymore. This has been looking forward to this all week.
Well, you know, there's enough here to carry you through the weekend. So, you know, you'll be able to continue to pair up all through there and enjoy it. I know I will. I have plans for every day digging in a little bit more. And I really appreciate having a little bit of a extra backlog of beer that you sent along the way. So I'll be able to share this a little later on.
Hey, you don't have to share it. It's all right. This is just for you, Michael. Go for it.
I appreciate that. Thank you. All right.
So if we do want to dive into the next pairing then.
All right. Let's jump there.
There we go. So we're diving into one of our newest year-round brands. This is a double IPA. It's called Florida Man. And I don't know how many folks are familiar with sort of the Twitter handle or the internet sensation of Florida Man. But again, Joey wants to tell the story of Florida, of his home state, through beer. And as much as we want to talk about sort of the finer and more nuanced parts of Florida history, whether it's Ybor City and the cigar manufacturing or the cattle industry with Florida Cracker, there's some of the more irreverent parts of Florida history that we're celebrating with Florida Man. So anytime you see something crazy in the world happening, it's always happening in Florida. Like Florida Man eats another man's face. Florida Man throws an alligator through Wendy's drive-thru. Florida Man believes his wife is a hologram. That one's one of my favorites. So there is a Twitter handle that emerged in the last couple of years that attributed all of these crazy stories to one person, the world's worst superhero, Florida Man. So that's sort of what we're celebrating here with this new double IPA. And it's a beer that we've done a few times. Originally, we had rolled it out back in 2015, and we kind of played with the recipe a little bit before it became a year-round brand. But this is now available across almost all of our distribution footprint. It's in our mixed 12-pack. So if you go to your local grocery store, we have a mixed 12-pack that has Highlight IPA, has Florida Cracker, has Guayabera, and right now it does have the Florida Man double IPA. So the hops that we're using, the big hop that jumps out at me in this one is El Dorado. When I think El Dorado, I'm getting, not only some of that bright citrus, but I'm getting a lot more melon as well, kind of some honeydew, some cantaloupe sort of quality. Again, like we were talking about with Guayabera, where the bitterness is taking a backseat, same thing with Florida Man double IPA. There are other double IPAs out there that really emphasize the piney, resinous, sort of bitter qualities of American hops. That's not what we're going for with Florida Man. We wanted something that was really emphasizing the hop flavor and hop aroma and more of the nuance rather than just sort of that, again, piney and resinous quality of American hops. This one is clocking in at 8.5%. But it sneaks up on you, just like Florida Man as a character might sneak up on you. Florida Man Double IPA is definitely one that might, kind of creep up. Again, comparing it to other double IPAs that are out there, especially some of those classic double IPAs. You think of Sierra Nevada Torpedo, you think of, Avery Maharaja, some of those other ones that were sort of around when double IPAs were really taking off. This one's way, way lighter in color. So it doesn't have that kind of deep red, deep sort of, almost brown color. This one's much lighter in color. It actually doesn't look dissimilar to the Guayabera Citra Pale Ale. So we're not using as much heavy crystal malt, not as much sort of that heavy caramel quality. And that is borne out not only in the color, but it also is borne out in the body of the beer. Again, for a double IPA, for an 8.5% beer, this is not a heavy beer and it's not a bitter beer. So kind of sticking your nose in there. Again, honeydew, little bit of more of like an orange zest. Not as much of that blueberry herbaceous quality we're getting with the Guayabera. But again, the El Dorado hops are really kind of popping out at me. It's almost like a papaya quality to it as well. And then color-wise, again, we're looking at a relatively light-colored beer for a double IPA. Little bit of haze to it as well. So part of that's coming from the amount of dry hop that we're throwing into this beer. We are throwing a ton of hops in this beer, and the hop compounds do suspend themselves in the beer, and that's going to give it a little bit of that haze. So it's not crystal clear like you're going to see in something like the Defeated Statesman. It's a little bit of haze to it. And then let's take a quick sip of this one. It's got this incredible like candied orange sweetness to it. So that citrus is coming through. It's a little bit of bitterness to help kind of bring everything into balance, but at the same time, it has this really interesting, like caramelized sugar, caramelized orange sort of quality to it, but then that honeydew, that melon quality coming in, and then just a little bit of lingering bitterness, but an incredibly fruit-forward beer for a beer of this strength. Normally, when you start getting this high in alcohol, you start looking at more IBUs, and you expect to have more body and more caramel quality to balance everything out. And that's not really what you're getting with Florida Man Double IPA. Very, very easy drinking. And again, we're talking about matching intensities. So this is a beer that, does have a little bit more affinity for cheese than a more traditional American Double IPA, more traditional beer that does have, again, resin, pine, the sort of dank quality. You end up hearing those descriptors used a lot for double IPAs, and I wouldn't use any of those descriptors for Florida Man. Just a really complex and nuanced double IPA that, frankly, will sneak up on you at 8.5%. And then as far as the cheese pairing, I'll kind of turn that over to you, sir.
Well, the direction that I wanted to go here was to really bring out more of the buttery flavors of the cheese. So I chose the Cypress Grove Humboldt Fog. And Humboldt Fog is a bloomy rind goat cheese. You can see that it's got a beautiful line of ash in the middle of this, ash along the rind as well. This has got a little bit of age to it, and that's intentional. Buying a pure white version of a bloomy rind cheese is going to bring you a really crusty, dry cheese. They got to give it a little bit of time for it to start to get a little bit more aging, which creates more butter flavors in it, makes it a little bit more creamier. A Humboldt Fog is after the fog that's out of California, out of the Humboldt Bay, and it has that kind of like grayish quality to it. And this is 100% goat's milk. It is Mary Keene created this. This is what's known as an American original, and I think that's really cool that we have a Florida man and then a Humboldt fog with this together. I'm also pairing it with a little bit of Savannah bee honey, whipped honey with a little bit of lemon. This cheese is really well known for being able to have this with a honeycomb. And so it's really nice to be able to have something like that, just a little bit. Again, we're not trying to make it sweeter. We're just trying to bring out some of the more buttery flavors. And then with the beer, we really get a lot more richness from it. What do you think?
Absolutely. With this one, I think less so than the Guayabera, what's helping to cut through some of the buttery quality is really that citrus quality. Again, papaya, honeydew, melon, all of that I think is really kind of helping to prevent the cheese from being too heavy and too sort of rich on the palate, which has been nice. But the fact that it doesn't have that bitterness is really allowing some of the more nuanced qualities of the cheese to really shine through. I think that, like you said, that little bit of ashy quality, that little bit of that vein of ash that is in the middle of that cheese is, again, helping to really bring the thing into balance rather than becoming overwhelmingly rich or overwhelmingly heavy on the palate. But again, sort of a traditional American IPA might end up being a little too bitter for something like this, where that bitterness is really going to walk all over some of the nuance that's in the cheese, and we're not running into that with Florida Man Double IPA. So again, I think this is, as far as intensity, really nicely matched.
It is. A lot of times you get people that are like, well, I'm not a big IPA fan because it's so hoppy. I'm not a hophead. Well, this isn't that type of hop. It's not in your face. It's really well balanced. But one of the things that happens with this particular cheese is that the hops, the intensity of them, they really drop down. Honestly, when you put these two together, immediately you get this drops down to like a pale ale or, even just a little lighter. And it's not a bad thing because that brings out more of the butter on the cheese. And Humboldt Fog has got a tremendous amount of butter to it. Even though a lot of people think about goat cheese as being just so tangy, this isn't. It's got a lot of cream flavors in through there. It has an interesting story as well, is that where Mary Keene, she moved up to Northern California with her husband, and they actually built their own log cabin up there and get settling in. She had 4 kids, and next door they had some cattle, and they also had some goats, and she was looking for to get some more natural, healthier milk, and by feeding her kids some goat's milk. So she thought that she would buy them or borrow them from the farm next door. She went next door and asked them about it, and the lady said, hey, if you can catch them, you can have them. And in a short period of time, she had like 40 goats. So she started making cheese. And, this is a story that is just amazing. When you think about it, somebody that got 2 goats, and then the next thing they know is this is like one of the most awarded cheeses, and it's so well done. And don't be afraid of the ash in here. The ash helps reduce the pH, which makes it just a little sweeter. It's a good thing through here. And it's very natural for a lot of the aged and or bloomy rind. And the rind is completely edible. Bloomy rind is kind of like a little bit of a white button mushroom. So you get a little mushroom in there, but it's not like a heavy. It's just enough that works in here that gives it some structure that holds up to the IPA. And I think that's important to understand, is that, like, if we were to pair this up with the fresh goat cheese, it would turn the goat cheese into cream. It would just be kind of like you added a little bit of cream to it because it doesn't have enough structure to be able to hold that up. And that's why the Humboldt Fog does really well in that instance.
It's funny that you added a little bit of honey to the cheese when you're tasting it, because I think that's actually what the beer is doing as well. We are adding, there's some certain specialty malts in there that do bring out a little bit of a honey quality, I think, as on its own. But then when you pair it with the cheese, it really does bring out more of this honey quality inside of the beer that you don't normally find. And just like you adding the honey to the cheese on its own, I think the beer is really doing that as well. And it's turning out really nice. It's a great pairing.
Yeah, I agree. You know, you don't have to have that extra little bit here. I do that because a lot of times when you're pairing something, you want to give a little bit of a kick in there. And for somebody that may not have been a fan of IPAs, especially a double IPA, there'd be a lot of people that would probably be hesitant to be able to do that, where a little bit of whipped honey with lemon in here, it really does accent the lemon in the beer. And so it kind of fuses these things together. So they play upon each other really well. You don't have to have it, and it's just a nice little bonus. It's kind of like the cracker having that. You don't want something that's going to get in the middle of it. However, if I was going to use a flavor in here, I'd probably do a little rosemary olive oil cracker, because this all would really, the little bit of herb that would work really well with the beer, that would work really well with the cheese, it would really bring things out even more. But, you know, alone, the cheese and the beer is fantastic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've been enjoying that one a lot, most certainly. So ready to dive into the next beer if you're ready for it, sir. There we go. So diving right into the next beer, and I kind of referenced this one a few times. This is, excuse me, is the Maduro Brown Ale. This is the very, very first beer that we ever brewed back in 2009. So it certainly has a sentimental spot for us as a brewery. Beside that, this is, if I had to pick a favorite, this is my favorite year-round beer that we do. The brown ale, you know, early 2000s had a little bit more of a time in the spotlight, and it's a style that hasn't really taken off the way that an IPA has or a double IPA has. But within this category, this American brown ale, this beer I really think is exceptional. I think you could put this in a lineup of any 5 American brown ales, and you'd be able to pick out which one is Maduro. So what really separates this beer is there are some oats in there. They're going to add some body, add some creaminess. This is a beer that I put in front of people, and then when I tell them that there is no actual chocolate in the beer, it's mind blown, because there's so much chocolatey quality, and that's coming from not only from the type of yeast that we're using, but for the most part coming from the specialty malts that are in this beer. So there is some chocolate malt, a few other, specialty malts that are bringing out this chocolate, toffee, a little bit of a roast espresso quality to the beer. It's only 5.5%. What I tell people is this beer is almost like a more moderate bodied and moderate alcohol American stout or American porter, because it does have so much more chocolatey quality and so much more body than your typical American brown ale. It also doesn't have the bitterness that you expect out of a typical American brown, you know, a Brooklyn brown ale or an Avery Ellie's brown ale, which are both exceptional beers, phenomenal beers, very exemplary for the style. But this beer really doesn't have the bitterness that those beers do, and it's much more chocolate focused, and it's much more caramelly, chocolatey, again, a little touch of espresso to the beer as well. But when I put my nose in that beer, I think cocoa powder. Not only is it, you know, baker's chocolate, but it's just straight up cocoa powder. It does have a little bit of kind of a woody, earthy hop quality. We're using some English hops in this beer. When I think English hops, I always think, yeah, woody, earthy, a little, sometimes some minty quality. So just a little bit of a woody quality to that. There really isn't the fruit quality that you expect out of IPAs or you expect out of these more expressive estery beers. It certainly is not one of those beers. And then you take a sip. Yeah, again, cocoa powder, baker's chocolate, some toffee, and then just a little touch of roast, a little touch of espresso at the end, maybe a little hint of smoke, but not a ton, just enough to kind of help bring the whole thing into balance. What I love about it, though, is for all of those sort of rich descriptors, it's a very moderate bodied beer. It's only 5.5% alcohol. It doesn't sit heavy on the palate like a big imperial stout or a porter or anything like that. So it's kind of everything I love in a good stout or porter in a 5.5% alcohol package. The name on this one, the Maduro, we're taking that name from a dark wrapper on a cigar. The cigar reference is in turn a Cigar City reference. So when we're talking about cigar history, we're talking about Ybor City, we're talking about Tampa, we're talking about really the history of the area where the brewery has started. But again, not only is it the first beer we ever brewed, so it has a sentimental spot in that sense, but to me, this is just an exceptional beer that is idiosyncratic. Again, you could put it in a lineup of a lot of other brown ales and you would be able to pick out Maduro every single time. Just really, really tasty. And again, for only 5.5%, it's got a lot of flavor to it. And then it's the fact that it does have that chocolatey quality and that creaminess, I think makes it a perfect beer for pairing, not only with cheese, but you're talking with burger, you're talking with barbecue. This beer really it has a lot of versatility when it comes to food and beer pairing. But I'm excited to try it with some of the cheese.
You know, what's really funny is that as you're talking, I'm thinking all these things that I want to say, and it's like, God, it would need another hour to be able to go over the brown, because this is just such a great pairing, cheap beer. All right, so we're pairing this with the Tillamook, and the Tillamook has come out with a vintage series, really amazing cheeses. You know, a lot of times you see the Tillamook that's in the store, in the regular grocery or in the dairy section, but this is their premium line. And if you haven't had it, you got to hunt this down, because these are some of the best cheddars I've ever had. And these are vintage, which means that they're aged out. So this is a 2016 that you have. I have a 2015, and the really beautiful part about this is that these cheddars have so much butter and cream in addition to their tanginess. So it's really a fun, simple, and really easy pairing. For people that are big fans of cheddars, this is a great way to be able to go. And you know, when we were talking about the beer, is that I remember sitting down with Wayne with a bunch of cheeses. We were doing an event, and so we were kind of like, okay, so let's pair up each of these cheeses. And every time that we paired any cheese with the Maduro Brown, Wayne would go, all right, perfect. It was like we could have just done the Maduro Brown and every cheese, because they all worked perfectly together. I mean, this is, you know, this is one of the best and easiest. If you want to have one beer that's going to go with everything, I would say that. And it's funny is that when we were at GABF, you guys won a couple of gold medals, and I won my first gold medal at the same time for a black lager that I collaborated with 610. And it's funny that, you know, in the process that, you know, you go in the brewing about what you're going to do. And here in Tampa, you know, we're at 610, we're not going to go, well, let's try to compete against High Life or compete against a Maduro Brown or a Cracker. You know, we did our own thing. And, you know, that is what is so cool about this beer, is that when you do taste it, you know that it's Maduro Brown. You know that it's not just it's not, you know, any of the others. It's so Cigar City.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head, Michael. This is a beer that really, I think, encapsulates what Cigar City is all about. It's complex, but it's approachable. It's moderate alcohol, and it is, you know, we both said it in a few different ways, but it's so versatile when it comes to food and beer pairings. It can really pair with so many different things, whether it's, you know, it'll temper some of the char on something like a steak or a burger. It'll mellow out some of the spice in, you know, a mole or something like that. It'll add some dimension. It'll add some depth to a cheese. You know, it'll really not only, you talked about sort of the tempered, tanginess or the tempered acidity that's in something like the aged cheddar. This does a really good job of doing even that, where it's accentuating some of the more creamy qualities of the cheese and really helping to temper some of the sharpness of the cheddar. You always think sharp cheddar, and the beer is really helping to take some of the sharpness off and bring out some of the body, some of the creaminess of the cheese as well.
Well, the maltiness really goes well with the cream. So you get this malt cream, butter, along with that tanginess. As much as you love that, you do lose a little bit of the tanginess. It really kind of drops down a little bit. But without the tanginess, there wouldn't be the structure for it to be able to stand up to the beer. In other words, if you did a mild cheddar, you would lose any of the real flavors of the cheddar because there's not enough strength to be able to do that.
Right.
Where, you think by itself, it's got a great tanginess to it. It's got a great flavor. In recipes, my wife is from Texas and does a brisket that is, like overnight. It's just an amazing thing that she does. And, it's always done with Maduro Brown now because this caramelizes so well in its sauce that there isn't, it's like the secret sauce.
Yeah. We're not just paying Michael to say that, I promise.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So if you're looking at doing cheddars, on this particular direction, because there's so many out there. I mean, America is cheddared. So you really want to go with something sharp, something aged, something a little more crunchy. And this one, something that you want to note on this is that there's a lot of crystallization in here, and this crystallization is what's known as calcium lactate. And calcium lactate adds to the crunchy feel that you get with it. It also gives you a little bit of the amino acids that are through there. But that crunchiness tells you about its true aging. In other words, the calcium lactate comes from the salt. This is when they make this, they actually add salt to the curd. So it's bonded on there. When it hits a warm curd, it actually melts. And when they pack it together from the curd, little holes are put in there where the liquid just micro sits in there. And as it ages, the moisture dries out and it leaves the shell of the salt, which is the calcium lactate, which gives you that white film or that white spots on there. So a lot of people see the white spots and think, oh my God, it's molding. No, it's calcium lactate, very, very normal. As a matter of fact, that is what you want to see in an aged cheddar. You don't see those spots on there, then there's something wrong. It's not a real deal. This is real deal. And when you pair it up with something like the intensity of this with the richness and the flavor and the maltiness, oh my God, this is just amazing.
Well, I think you bring up an important point, especially when it comes to beer and cheese pairings, is texture. I love wine. I'm a big wine geek as well. But when you're talking about wine, you're not talking about texture as much as you are with beer. Because beer, you get carbonation, essentially. You get a lot more kind of variety when it comes to a very, very dry, crisp beer like the Defeated Statesman we're going to be drinking, or a very, very heavy, sweet beer that has a ton of residual sugar. You're talking about carbonation, you're talking about acidity. And those are things that, you might touch on with wine, but you don't get as wide a spectrum with wine as you do with beer when it comes to, again, texture, carbonation, bitterness, all of these things that you really are not discussing when it comes to wine. So I'm not saying beer is better than wine. I would never say that, but I'm just saying when it comes to pairing, it does offer a lot more dimension that you don't necessarily see when it comes to a wine and cheese pairing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a quartermaster sommelier myself and beer server cicerone. So I don't know how many times have we said beer is liquid bread, about, using the grains and all of that. And you think about what cows eat grain, they eat grass, You know, they don't eat grapes, you know. So you think about the grass-fed and the grain and all these things that go together. They have a natural part. I find that most people that are, you know, even light beer drinkers will pair up and find a nice pairing better than somebody that's a novice wine drinker. Wine takes some, you know, some education. It's not as easy, I think, to pair and drink because it's a little more complicated in that respect, and also your way you like it. What I always say about pairings, and this is my advice for 15 years, is that if you don't know if the pairing works, start with a beer that you love, all right, and then get the cheese. And if it doesn't work, you got a beer that you love.
It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. I think you've got the right approach, Michael.
Always try. You know, I mean, both of us, you know how we learned? We drank, we ate. I mean, you know, you don't pick this up in a book. This is something that, you know, I mean, obviously for the exam, you know, you have to know a lot of stuff about, you know, things, rivers and where they made beer and all that. But the reality is that drink more, eat more, put them together and see what you like. It's not, there's a little bit of a science to it, but also there's just the simplicity of that they just taste good together. Like this, they taste good together.
Exactly. It's all about experiential learning, you know, and as silly as that sounds, there's, you know, you touched on it, I think, very eloquently. You can read about it all you want, but there's times where you have a beer and you have a dish, you have a cheese, whatever it may be, and you try them together and you go, all right, I've read in a book this is supposed to taste good together. This is terrible. And then vice versa, you end up with a dish and you sort of, you know, have, well, the only thing I got in the fridge is Maduro, and you try it with, you know, a fish, and you go, this is exceptional. This is really, really great. So that's the way to learn, is trial and error. And like you said, worst comes to worst, you've got a glass full of beer or a glass of wine that is going to help help things be okay.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So we can jump right into the next beer in that case, if you're ready.
Of course.
Absolutely. Otherwise, you're going to end up with just Michael and I kind of waxing poetic about beer and cheese pairings for another 2 hours.
Which isn't a bad thing.
Nah, that's fine. So Margarita Gose. This is another one that's a relatively new year-round brand for us. It's a brand that was originally developed back in 2014 as part of our 5 Beers for 5 Years series. It's actually, the way that the beer came about was pretty neat. For our 5th anniversary, we kind of split the brewery into 5 different teams. We had our brewing team, our packaging team, we had our tasting room team. We had a number of, you know, essentially the different departments within the brewery, and each department got to develop their own recipe. And our packaging guys, those guys are working out in an on-air conditioned warehouse all day long, putting our beer into kegs, cans, and bottles. So at the end of the day, those guys wanted something light, crisp, refreshing, a little tart to kind of, you know, again, get that thirst-quenching quality to it. So they designed a beer called Margarita Gose. So the Gose, the style is actually called Gose. It's a style that developed in Goslar, Germany. Really, it's a very, very traditional style of beer where a lot of beers essentially would have tasted like this a few hundred years ago because of the lack of sanitation, because of essentially not understanding what would make a beer sour. You would end up with, the majority of beer probably did have some acidity to it. And certainly is borne out in Margarita Gose. So the Gose style, you're always expecting a beer from, the style originated in Germany. It's got some wheat, it's always got some acidity, it's always got some tartness, and salt is really what kind of separates the Gose style from the Berliner Weiss style. That's, you know, they're both kind of two sides of the same coin. There's some nuance, but picture a light, low alcohol, tart, refreshing beer with just a little touch of salt. So that's the Gose style. And then the Margarita, pretty self-explanatory. We were inspired by the Margarita, so we wanted to add orange, lime, and salt to this beer. So it's a beer we kind of played around with a little bit. We originally did it in bottles, then we were releasing it in draft, and we said, this is just such, especially in the state of Florida, this is a perfect beer for the beach. It's a perfect beer for the poolside. Again, because of that low alcohol content, you can have a couple throughout the day. And that acidity is just this great thirst slaking, really great quality to the beer. This is my go-to warm weather beer, again, because of that moderate alcohol content. But as we're sniffing it, so we're getting beer on the nose, just a ton of orange, lime zest, a little bit of like overripe lemon as well. And then just, you know, a little touch of that kind of salty aroma, not a whole lot to it. You know, with a low alcohol, moderate body beer like this, we're looking for sort of balance. So we didn't want to have an overwhelmingly sour beer. We didn't want to have an overwhelmingly fruity beer. We wanted everything to sort of be in balance and make it a good, you know, sipping sort of beer. So again, little touch of salt, but bright orange, lime zest, and then kind of overripe lemon. And then on the palate, the acidity is perfect. It's not overwhelmingly tart. It's not, you know, like that warhead candy sort of, you know, mouth puckering acidity, but it does kind of get the salivary glands kicking. So it does have that kind of thirst slaking quality to it. The orange is in there. The lime is definitely in there. I think the lime's in there a little bit more than the orange. And just a little touch of salinity, not a, you know, it's not like drinking salt water or anything like that. 4.2%, very refreshing, very easy drinking. The acidity and the high carbonation. This is a beer that's also carbonated just a little bit higher than something like the Maduro Brown Ale or the Guayabera. And that also helps really cut through fat, cut through creaminess, cut through any buttery quality that we might find in some of the cheese as well. But this is a beer that's available year-round. I always have a six-pack of Margarita Gose in the fridge because of that moderate alcohol quality. I can have a couple and be, you know, okay. And then just that thirst slaking, that kind of nice, refreshing acidity. What's amazing about this beer too is we were one of the very, very first breweries to experiment with a new style of making sour beer. Normally, most sour beers that you find, they're going to be pitching bacteria in the beer. It's totally innocuous. It's not a pathogen or anything like that. But it's lactobacillus. It's essentially the same stuff. I know Michael had kind of touched on that a little bit. What brings out some of the zinginess, some of the tartness in some cheeses, or what you're going to see in yogurt. It's what makes yogurt tart is lactobacillus. It creates lactic acid. So normally, with almost all sour beers that you see, it's either going to be some wild yeast or some bacteria that creates lactic acid. There's a yeast lab that's actually creating a style of Saccharomyces. So it's the same type of yeast that's used to ferment all of the rest of these beers, but as a sort of byproduct, it produces lactic acid, which is not something you see in most styles of Saccharomyces, most species of Saccharomyces. So we were one of the first breweries that was working with Lallemand Yeast Labs to work on, it ended up being called Sour VCA. So instead of Cerevisiae, which is the Latin name for brewer's yeast, it's Sour VCA. So it's a normal Cerevisiae Saccharomyces yeast that's producing lactic acid. So all of that technical stuff aside, what I find within this is it creates a tartness that's a little less sharp. It's not overwhelmingly, again, mouth-puckeringly sour. It creates a more nuanced, a more kind of rounded sour quality, more rounded tartness. Really, really great beer. And I'm always drinking a lot of this Margarita Gose because it's so easy drinking and such moderate content. And then getting into some of the cheese pairing on this one, again, it does have so much dimension, whether it's the saltiness, whether it's the carbonation, or whether it's the acidity. It has a lot of versatility when it comes to pairing.
Yeah, so for this, you know, one of the things that took me a while to get used to is that when I drink beer, I expect a lot of grain, a lot of maltiness and through there. So sours have always been a little more challenging for me, but I've developed a better understanding and an appreciation for them. And there are a handful that I really just love. And this hits the right zone. So I paired it up with the Sartori. This is the BellaVitano Gold Parmesan. And this is incredibly buttery. It's got a lot of rich flavors to it that bring out the butter. It brings out a little bit of a kind of like a hay-like flavor. Parmesans are really interesting when you get that little bit of sweetness. So when you go up against a sour like this, one of the things that you want it to do is to not lose that flavor, but bring it together. So you can imagine that the way that these work together is they bring those nice flavors of the lemon, the lime, the tanginess, all that you expect, and you get a more of a balance of those flavors. In other words, like a margarita, I would say that a lot of times there's so much acidity, tannic there that it wears your palate down. Well, the butter in here, what it does is it kind of coats it. It doesn't disturb it. It kind of balances into the flavor and brings it to more of a mellower flavor. So you don't per se tone it, you more or less balance it out. So it's not so on the edge here, kind of like you're listening to music and the treble's a little too high and you drop it down just a little bit. That's exactly what you do, is you just bring it down just a little bit, but you don't take it away, you just bring it down, and that's what's really nice. And Sartori's been making Parmesan since 1938, a fourth generation of cheesemakers. You know, one thing about Wisconsin is that you hear a lot of things about the quality of their cheeses, and honestly, they make some of the most award-winning cheeses like Sartori and others that are out there. Carvel, I can name 30 of these guys. The Wisconsin cheeses that are being made by master cheesemakers. Now, when you think about this, is that anywhere in the United States, except for Wisconsin, you don't have to have a license to make cheese. In Wisconsin, you have to have a license. You have to be a licensed cheesemaker. But to be a master cheesemaker, you have to have made that cheese under direct supervision in cooperation with the authorities for 10 years. So, you know, these guys that are making this cheese are not just making the cheese out of a continuous, they make it because it's a higher quality. When you talk about you were talking about lactobacillus, and we're talking about the bacteria, and the bacteria that make these, you know, are very unique to Sartori, that give them a very rich and robust cheese, which is one of the few things that I would actually pair up that go perfectly with this. Magnificent.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's such a unique thing about cheese making. And you're also specifically talking about it with winemaking, and to an extent with beer as well, is these products are all a representation of a place and a time. You know, that lactobacillus, like you said, that's specific to that area where that cheesemaker exists. So you wouldn't, if you had everything else being equal, without that specific type of lactobacillus that only is existent in that particular area of the world, you wouldn't be able to make the same cheese. And that's what makes this stuff so cool. You know, other than it being delicious, you can't create a lot of these products without a specific time and a specific place. Beer to a lesser extent, because you are, you know, a place like Florida, we don't grow hops, we don't grow barley. But at the same time, we're still informed by the citrus industry. We're still informed by the history of the place. And once you really wrap your head around those aspects of these products, it makes you appreciate what you're eating and what you're consuming so much more. It's pretty cool. How's your Margarita Gose treating you, Michael?
Oh, you're exactly right about it being a go-to. This is so refreshing, so easy. One of the things that I pick up immediately is that there's, you know, that beautiful tartness. This isn't a Skittle tart. This is a natural citrus tartness that is perfectly balanced in the beer. But after taking a sip, you kind of crave a little sweetness. It's kind of like the salted caramel. You like the salt, you like the caramel, those contrasts. And so, when you take a bite of the cheese and then you take a sip of the beer, and then you take a sip of the beer, you want more cheese because you want that balance of that buttery flavor that comes across. So it's very addicting.
It's absolutely with these tart sour beers. Yeah, you take a sip and you find yourself habitually just throwing them back. They're so tasty.
Yeah, it is. I'm down through this one a lot faster than the others because it's just so easy to be able to drink, and it goes so well with the cheese that it's just a nice little balance. This again would be something that you don't have to create a evening event for. This could be, you decide that it's time to have a beer. I want something to go along with it. You can pick up a Parmesan, one of the Sartoris in there, the BellaVitanos, or any one of their line, and you can really find that this works really well, and you get a little bit of protein, a little bit of snacking with it. I don't even want to add the cracker to it. It's not necessary. Yeah. These two have just a nice balance together.
Oh yeah, in working on the pairings, this was a beer I knew we were going to pair with some type of cheese because it's so versatile. It was really just kind of narrowing down which cheese it was going to be best suited with.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I figure we'll get into the last beer before we get into doing this for 4 or 5 hours, because I know you and I could sit and again pontificate about this stuff for quite a while. But I figure we'll get into the last beer. This is a beer that is exclusive to the Cigar City Brewing tap room in Tampa, Florida. So this is a beer you will never find out in the market. It's a beer you will only be able to get inside of our tap room. It's a beer called Defeated Statesman American Lager. So we've been, it's funny, myself, our Director of Brewing Operations, Sean Sasser, a lot of the folks that have been in the beer industry for quite a while, look, we all love Highlight IPA. We all love these big barrel-aged imperial stouts. But a lot of times at the end of the day, we want something that's a little more crisp, easy drinking. Sometimes you just want, for lack of a better term, beer-flavored beer. So we have been playing around with a few different lager recipes, and one of the most recent has been this Defeated Statesman American Lager. So what sort of makes an American lager compared to a Pilsner, compared to a German lager, compared to a Czech-style Pils or anything like that? So one thing when you see American, and when you're talking about American lager, pre-Prohibition Pils, anything like that, is going to be the addition of corn, either corn and or rice. So this beer's got 2 types of heritage corn. And then, it's kind of let's say a judgment call when something kind of crosses the threshold from an American lager to an American Pilsner. Really, the point of differentiation is the bitterness level. Both beers are going to use similar ingredients. They're both going to be similar alcohol content. They're both going to use corn. They're both going to it's going to be a lot of similarities, but it's really the emphasis on bitterness that differentiates American lager from American Pilsner or pre-Prohibition Pilsner or something like that. So with this beer, the bitterness just took a little bit more of a back seat than you would expect out of an American Pils. But we are using some newer hops in this one. We're using some Laurel hops. We're using some hops that are throwing off a little bit more grassy, earthy, herbaceous qualities to them, more so than you would see in a German-style Pilsner. But again, when we're talking American, we're talking about corn. In this, we're talking about lighter American beers. When you see American, you're probably going to be expecting some corn or rice, and this has 2 types of heritage corn. And then, the bitterness just isn't there compared to something like an American Pilsner or pre-Prohibition Pils. So my sort of being drawn to pull this beer into the pairing as well, I wanted to have something that we could only get at the Cigar City tap room, just to kind of really talk about some of the cool stuff that we're doing, because anytime you walk into our tap room on Spruce Street, you're always going to be able to get something you can't get anywhere else in the world. We do so many different beers that we don't send into distribution. Sometimes we'll put in a can, sometimes it'll just be draft only, but we've always got something that we're experimenting with. We've always got something new and interesting that you will only be able to get at the tap room. So I wanted to do that, and that's why we've got it in sort of this bigger 32-ounce crowler here. I love these crowlers. So it's the same, mechanics as a growler, essentially, where you're taking draft beer and putting it into a vessel to go. But instead of just screwing in the top where you're allowing a lot more oxygen ingress, we're putting it into essentially a giant 32-ounce can. So the oxygen levels are a lot lower, freshness is a lot better, and you've got a 32-ounce can of beer. It's not bad at all. But Defeated Statesman, 4.7%, light, crisp, a little bit of that corn quality because, again, we are using 2 types of heritage corn. Bitterness takes a back seat. It's got a little touch of that fresh cut grass, hay quality from the hops that we're using, but balanced, easy drinking. Again, for lack of a more nuanced term, it's beer-flavored beer, but with a much more clean, crisp approach than you would expect out of the Bud Miller Coors of the world. I love this beer, and a lot of the folks that work in the brewery, this is what we're going to at the end of the day, rather than kind of a big, intense IPA. We just want kind of a crisp, easy drinking beer, and this is a good one. So again, with the balance, the easy drinking quality, really, this was another beer I knew we wanted to include in the pairing. It was just a matter of finding the right cheese for it. I think this beer could have paired up with most of the cheeses that we've tasted through so far, but getting into the lamb chopper, I think this was actually a really, really appropriate, really good pairing on this one. I'm curious to hear what you think, Michael.
Yeah, I think that, when you're talking about a beer that has this light flavors, you don't want something that's going to crush the beer. You want something that's going to really bring that up. And lamb chopper is a sheep's milk cheese, kind of like a sheep's milk Gouda, you'd say, but it's got more of a bready quality to it, and it's got a lot of butter. And sheep's milk has got more butter than any other type of milk to it. So you really have that buttery advantage that you have with the sheep's milk. And again, Cypress Grove, really focuses on a high quality, using the attributes of the type of milk. And the lamb chopper, which, and if you see the label there, says born to be mild, is actually in a way that's true, is that it's not going to be that big, all encompassing style. It's going to be very, very light and rich and buttery. And so adding buttery to the beer is kind of like breading a biscuit. I mean, honestly, it's like breading a biscuit.
Oh, absolutely. It's it's adding some of the creaminess and adding some of the depth of flavor to the malt quality of the beer, which is pretty simplistic. It's pretty straightforward. But then vice versa, the bitterness that's in there, which is pretty mild, is actually helping to cut through some of the buttery quality, some of the creamy quality. And we've touched on that sort of contrast with a number of these pairings. But I really feel like the lamb chopper is helping to emphasize some of the nuance in the malt, and vice versa. The bitterness that's in the beer is helping to cut through some of the creaminess and really helping to accentuate some of the, the more nuanced parts of the cheese as well. Really, really cool pairing, and it's a complex beer for what it is. The beer is not designed for complexity, but at the same time, I think there's a lot that you can tease out about a beer like this, and that the cheese helps emphasize some of those more nuanced qualities of it.
So I was thinking that, that these two, they work on the same plane. You get the butter, you get the grains, it's really, really nice. So I wanted to add in something that would be kind of unique, but also work really well with the carbonation and all that, because you can actually add more butter to this, because this is a cleansing beer. This helps really clean the palate. You can really throw a lot of stuff in here that's got butter to it, and you know, sheep's milk is going to have that. And so the Spotted Trotter out of Atlanta does a duck prosciutto. And so I'm marrying up the little duck prosciutto with the lamb chopper. And so that extra little bit of butter gives you the meaty flavors of the duck, the real rich flavors, but the beer cleans and adds to it. So it's just really things that you can add to this. Charcuterie added to any of the cheeses would work because of the beer.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's adding dimension, and I think every time you bring in, whether it's dried fruit, whether it's a preserve or a jam, or whether it's some charcuterie, just adds another dimension to things. And like we were talking about earlier, only way to figure out what works with all this stuff is to give it a shot. You can read about, all right, yeah, this this type of chorizo will pair with this type of wine or this type of beer, but it's not until you actually try them out and you have them both on a plate and in a glass that you figure out what actually works. So that's, I guess, our challenge to you is try some of these things out, figure out what works for you, and there's no wrong answers when it comes to pairing. If it works for you, and as long as you can explain what's going on and what works for you, there are no wrong answers. It's great.
Well, pairing is like love. It's in the eye of the beholder. You know, some people like certain directions, but I think that the guide that you should think about when you're doing a pairing is that no matter what, there's going to be some change. Some things that are good, some things that are, you know, maybe not the direction that you want. But the idea that you can take like the hoppiness of a beer and have a cheese that brings it down, which mellows both of them out, where the if you didn't have the hops, you wouldn't mellow out the cheese. But if you didn't have, you know, the style, that intensity of cheese, you wouldn't be able to mellow out the hops. And so if you had it with a lighter beer, you wouldn't get the pairing. It would be one versus the other. So don't be afraid to grab a beer that you might think would be out of your league, maybe a little bit stronger, because they can enhance and stand up to a lot of the really fun cheeses. And that's the really fun thing about trying different pairings, is that you don't know what you're going to discover for your own palate. They're like little factories. So, you know, what you put in is what you get out individually, not as we couldn't tell somebody that this is actually the best pairing for every person in the world. It would be impossible. But what we're saying is that the lightness of this beer, the buttery flavors of the cheese, they do work really well together. This isn't a hard choice, but there are options that you can do that will make it a little bit more entertaining, a little bit more, up that next level.
Yeah.
As you try different things, there are go-tos. Everybody has a recipe that it's like, okay, well, if somebody's coming over, I'm gonna do this casserole, or I got to go over to somebody's house and I got to bring something. Well, this is my dish. Well, again, we kind of develop that in our pairings.
Exactly. And really, there are no wrong answers. If you're happy with it, if you feel like this beer or this cheese or this wine or this, charcuterie or this dish works well together, then they do. There's no wrong answers. That's, and to your point earlier, Michael, worst comes to worst, if you do work on a pairing and it ends up falling flat on its face, worst case scenario, you end up with a glass of beer you really like, or a glass of wine you really like, or a dish you like, and the beer just doesn't happen to cut it. So it's a beautiful thing.
I have a friend that eats any cheese. They really believe in They eat the rind of hard cheeses. They eat everything on there. And, it's good to have a friend like that, because when you run into a cheese that isn't going to be the perfect pairing, you have somebody that will, find it, this is their thing. So kind of like, we run into our own, I wouldn't say prejudices, but our direction of what we like, and what we think would be really a good pairing. Is I want to encourage everybody to go out and try things that would be maybe a little different, but to put things together that you like. You like a really good goat cheese, and you're not really sure what kind of beer. Start off with the beer that you like and then work for there. A lot of times we discover some of the best direction by finding out what we don't like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It makes a ton of sense. And always more to learn.
Exactly.
You're drinking good beer and eating good food in the name of knowledge. It's a beautiful thing.
And I have a 32 ouncer to go with it. So, I'm all set for the rest of the night.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Exactly.
Yeah, so just a quick thing, how to follow up with Cigar City Brewing. Again, we do have a tap room over on Spruce Street in Tampa. If you are local to the area, we're open 7 days a week. The hours vary between weekdays and weekends, but again, we've always got a beer on draft that you've never had before, a ton of beer that's exclusive to the tap room. We have a full service kitchen as well. We have a retail space. You can buy merchandise. So definitely, if you're interested in beer and you're interested in Cigar City, you have to come by the Spruce Street tap room. And then a few of our social media handles, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all that stuff. Got my email address as well. If there's ever anything that we can do, if you have questions about our beer, if you have questions about pairing, we're here to talk about our brand. We're here to get people excited about what it is we're doing in Tampa. So, to kind of surmise, just wanted to say thank you to Michael for having us. Again, we've worked together a number of times. His depth of information and his depth of expertise on cheese and pairing and beer in general is phenomenal. We're lucky to have him on our side. We're lucky to have him as a resource. And thank you to the folks who have been tuning in and the folks who are watching us drink beer and eat cheese.
Well, thank you so much. Again, it's same thing is that, you and I have worked together long enough and through these years to know that it's a collaboration, our ability to be able to help each other and to be able to do these things and help other people understand. I'm hopeful that maybe we can, in a couple months from now, look at another round of beers and do another session, coming up.
Yeah, don't threaten me with a good time, Michael.
All right. Well, we'll definitely talk about this, and hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to meet at the brewery face to face and enjoy a beverage together.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for folks who are tuning in. And we'll do it again soon. It'll be great.
All right. Thanks, Neil.
All right.
So everybody else, thanks so much for standing by and enjoying this little adventure with us. We really enjoy being able to bring these to you. Next week, I have some really fun and exciting, different people coming on. I have the wonderful folks at Effie's coming on, their homemade biscuits. And I know that sounds like, oh my God, biscuits, but they pair up with cheeses like you don't believe. All right. And then, of course, I'm going to have a cider on there. Gypsy Cider's coming on. And then on Friday, we're really lucky because we're going across the pond to visit with Mary Quick with Quick's Traditional Cheddars. Really amazing family and multiple generations of cheese making in Cheddar, England. Yeah, that's right. So cheddar from cheddar. So it'll be really fun. So thanks a lot. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next week. All right. Bye.